After the death of Saul, David had already returned from defeating the Amalekites. David stayed two days in Ziklag. And David intoned this dirge over Saul and his son Jonathan. He ordered the Judites to be taught the song of the bow. It is recorded in the book of Jashar. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How have the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath. Do not proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistine rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. O hills of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain on you, or bountiful fields. For there the shield of warriors lay rejected, the shield of Saul, polished with oil no more. From the blood of slain, from the fat of warriors, the bow of Jonathan never turned back. The sword of Saul never withdrew empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and cherished, never parted in life or in death. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in crimson and finery, who decked your robes with jewels of gold. How have the mighty fallen in the thick of battle? Jonathan slain on your heights. I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. You were most dear to me. Your love was wonderful to me, more than the love of women. How have the mighty fallen? The weapons of war perished. Again, the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord lives forever. And this is the word of the Lord. All thanks be to God. You know, we have lost a lot of people throughout the course of this pandemic in this past year and a half, which is definitely not over yet, even though so many of us are vaccinated and feeling better and making some progress. It's far from over. As of this week, 3.88 million people have died from coronavirus. 3.88 million. Now, of course, a lot of people die every year, and in some circumstances, it's hard to tell who might have died anyway, whether or not they had gotten the virus. It's hard to distinguish that. But one interesting measure I saw was that in nursing homes in 2020, there was a 32% higher death rate than usual. 32% more death than usual. We could spend all day looking at different statistics to wrap our minds around the numbers and the situation, but all I'm really trying to get to with this is that we have suffered a staggering amount of losses recently. Lost a staggering amount of people we love, many of whom much sooner than ever expected. There's a lot of grief in the air. And last week we touched on how there's a lot of anger in the air. How angry people seem to be right now and all over the world, with special mention to us in this nation, as we are some of the most angry out there. Anger is a companion of grief. If you know grief, you know how easy it is to slip into an explosion of anger when you're grieving. It would make a lot of sense for us all to look at, especially if we're dealing with some anger issues right now, any of us, for us to think about how much of our anger is really just simply coming out of our grief and not really that other stuff that we are on the surface mad about. Well, today in the scripture we see David fall into his own dark cloud of grief. Now, this beautiful poem we just read from David, lamenting, expressing his grief upon learning that King Saul was dead. Not only King Saul, but also Jonathan, Saul's son, with whom David was very, very close. with the losses he suffered and what we see in the greater picture of the Scripture, I think I'd be doing you a disservice not to mention the first part of the passage today that we skipped over. The lectionary schedule skips over that portion because in that portion we've got a very challenging issue for us Christians to reckon with. It doesn't fit into the teachings of Jesus. This part that we didn't read, that first half of the Scripture, is about how David received the bad news and his first response toward the guy who gave him that bad news. So the Israelites, they were fighting again with the Philistines, but this time they lost. King Saul, in a courageous, misguided attempt to win that battle, he ends up surrounded by his enemies, facing his own death. The Philistines killed Saul's sons, including Jonathan, and now they were bearing down on Saul himself. And in that famous way that warriors have been known to deprive their enemies of the victory of killing them, Saul takes his own life. He lays down on his spear or on his sword. It depends which translation you read. And that's the end of 1 Samuel. Now here at the beginning of 2 Samuel, we find out that while he was laying there suffering, he was not dying as quickly as he was hoping he would. So an Amalekite, one of their enemies who they had fought, an Amalekite took pity on him, saw him, and Saul asked that Amalekite, he said, "Finish me off. Put me out of my misery." And so the Amalekite did. He killed him, but it was to relieve him of that suffering. So that Amalekite then took Saul's crown, took Saul's armlet, brought it to David. He showed up very respectfully, he bowed low before David. He told David everything that happened, including how he helped put Saul out of his misery. Seems to me like the Amalekite was doing a pretty good thing here. Seems like he should have been thanked in some way, appreciated a little bit. But David, he fell hard into his grief right away. He rips his clothes as a sign of his grief, which is customary at that time. David and the people with him immediately, they began lamenting, weeping, fasting. And then instead of thanking the Amalekite, David, as he got this bad news, David flips out. He got this news, he got proof of what happened to Saul. Saul was prevented of the suffering, but none of that registered. David just flipped out, lashes out at him. Immediately, David has the Amalekite killed, because the Amalekite killed the Lord's anointed. So, works with the tradition at the time, justified in that way, I guess. But it's a very troubling response, especially as we look at it with Christian eyes. And that's where we find ourselves today as David begins his funeral dirge, his poem of lament for his beloved Jonathan and for Saul, who up to this point has been trying to kill David. It's kind of a convoluted situation. Kind of blurs the lines between what's right and what's wrong. But what's very clear in this situation is this first reaction and then where David goes. It's very clear that David, was having kind of a bad reaction in the first place. And one that we should not latch onto, one that we should understand that's how the anger joins up with grief and just comes out and lashes out very hard. We Christians have been taught by Jesus that such violence like that has no place in our faith. So I feel kind of critical for David doing that. And it seems clear that that's a problem. But even though it's relatable, because that's what happens with us, we fall to our anger very easily when we know that we should look within and face our own grief head on. But as critical as I might feel about David doing that, the next thing he does is the complete opposite of the spectrum. And the next thing he does is something that we know we should do. At verse 19, David begins his poem from the depths of his heart and soul. And so while we're looking through the lenses of faith in Jesus, maybe feeling a little critical about his lashing out against that Amalekite, Hopefully we as Christians are paying very close attention to the second part that we read today and soaking this in as a good example of what we should do. As a commentator wrote this week, something that I read, we Christians have sometimes an issue with skipping over the grief process a little too fast and jumping right into the resurrection, not giving that grief process the time that it needs. We're often so focused on the joys of resurrection, we don't spend that adequate time in that darkness of grief. Now remember, it was the third day Jesus was risen from the dead. It didn't happen right away. They had this time to grieve and to sink into that for a little while and express their sadness in the various ways. What David does here with this poem is exactly the kind of thing we should do and exactly the kind of thing grief counselors will tell you to do today. To spend intentional time in that darkness, naming what you've lost, naming how it's impacting you, allowing yourself to experience those feelings that you're having, finding healthy and creative ways to pour out those feelings, spending time lamenting, crying, writing poetry, painting, weaving, giving expression to your grief, to give it a good, positive outlet instead of tucking it away, allowing that grief to morph into pure anger, hatred, or whatever else. In this poem, it says, "Your glory, O Israel, slain on your heights. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. The mighty Saul and the mighty Jonathan, among others, have fallen." And we can fill in the blanks with our own stories about the mighty who have fallen in the past year and a half. People we love, people we look up to, people who've taught us how to love, people who've taught us about grace, people who've had so much life left to live and shouldn't have gone so early. Oh, how our mighty economy has fallen. Lost jobs, lost retirements, lost homes, lost opportunities. Oh, how our mighty ways of life have fallen. Getting together with family and friends, going on trips, going out to the movies. Oh, how our mighty government is falling apart from divisive, angry infighting. Oh, how our mighty earth is falling apart from the environmental damage we're doing to it every day. And that's just with the first line where we can fill in the blanks. A few things that we've lost or are losing. David continues his poem, lamenting over Saul and Jonathan, losing them, expressing his hopes that such losses will not simply be to the joy of their enemies, inviting all the earth to share in this darkness of grief, to feel this pain, expressing the great courage of Saul and Jonathan as warriors, expressing the love between Saul and Jonathan, expressing his own love and sense of loss over Saul and especially for Jonathan, expressing how wonderful it's been to share love and life with them on this earth. We also have suffered terrible losses, much like David. But rather than falling into the consequences of not dealing with our grief, or about how those other powerful emotions slip in there that are a part of the grief that just overtake and cause us to do things we might regret. Rather than falling into that stuff, let us spend time that we need in our grief, as devastatingly painful as that is. Let us find healthy and creative ways to name and express our feelings, ranging all the way from the joys of the time and the love that has been shared together to tearing our clothes and sitting in the ashes. While we ought not to just skip ahead to the resurrection too quickly, remember that resurrection does await us on the other side of this darkness. As we journey forward, blessing the dead, blessing all that we have lost, blessing this time for our healing, blessing our own souls in our expressions of grief. May we find much reason to celebrate All in good time. As we find once more God's healing, God's love, God's grace.